could you just talk a bit about how the need for or the idea for the project came about?
As most listeners will remember, the big floods of 2004, 5, and 6. And so it was the first one, the remains of Hurricane Ivan that came through in September 2004. And really for smaller streams in the area, that was the biggest of the three, not the Lehigh and the Delaware, but for the small streams like the Bushkill or small tributaries, it was this September Ivan storm that was the big one. But it was something like 4 or 5 inches of rain in a short period of time in the wee morning hours. It was a Saturday. A high intensity storm, it caused a lot of damage on the steep slope of College Hill. There's an area that drains down from Forks Township, sort of a runoff channel. It doesn't have permanent flow, but there's a lot of water that's funneled through this one area, and that there's a neighborhood there that suffered quite a bit of damage. The streets were pretty torn up, a lot of overflow of the storm drain infrastructure and so forth. And then I think originally we were approached by Bob Freeman, who's our state representative who lives in that area, and we being the college as well as Bushkill Stream Conservancy originally, sort of as a partnership. So the project's a really great example of a community and college partnership focused on dealing with a local problem, in this case flooding. We had some meetings with Lafayette and the Stream Conservancy originally, and then the city of Easton was brought in as a partner. And we looked at potential ways to mitigate this issue in that area, and really pretty tough to deal with stormwater problems after the fact. So you either have to find a way to reduce the generation of runoff, which means you have to get a lot of homeowners on board with changing things in their lot and on their property, and that can be a heavy lift. So the other one is to find somewhere in the watershed where there may be some excess storage capacity. So that's where we lit on this Sullivan Park as a potential place where we might be able to direct some of the water and retain it. And, with this idea of a constructed stormwater wetland, we could treat the water.
Then could you talk about the different components of the project and the work that was involved in what you did there?
Yeah, so it took quite a while. The storm happened in September 2004, and it was beginning that next spring. After some meetings, I had a class that could potentially take on the project. And so we started that spring basically with some testing around the site. And so originally the field was a t-ball field in those days, but it was always very wet, muddy. There were actually cattails growing in the back of the outfield. And cattails are what's called an obligate wetland species. So if you find cattails growing somewhere, there is a permanent source of water there. And the back of that field, to the north side, always had these little springs bubbling up in it. And there was a little creek that ran off to the side and joined the other drainage channel. And so that gave us the idea of maybe a constructed wetland, which are in the Lehigh Valley are fairly rare because we often have situation where the soils are so well drained that water just drains down into them readily, and it's tough to find a place where you can kind of dig into the ground and find permanent water that shallow. So our idea was if we could use some of this park, and of course that meant some public meetings, and because we were taking away a previous use of the park. Now it was not well kept. I think I have some old photographs of it, but it wasn't like the jewel of the neighborhood by any means. So maybe that was part of why folks were supportive, but we did wind up taking away that t-ball field, or most of it. But then what the city did is they decided that as part of the overall project, they could invest funds in new playground equipment and upgrades to the site. So that helped too. So originally we did a lot of field work, measuring flows, testing what the soil was like and so forth to get an idea of and surveying to sort of see how much volume of water we could reasonably expect to capture at that site. We didn't want to convert the entire park into a wetland. We didn't think that would fly. In part it was there enough space there to make a dent in the runoff problem, and could we get the support of the community to, in essence, take away part of what that park used to be used for.
So, what was the impact of the project that you've seen so far? What is the site like now versus what it was like beforehand?
Well, one thing that's really amazing, so it took several years of iterations of the design and getting a firm on board to do a final design that was stamped by a PE, a licensed PE and insured, design firm. And so we got through the Stream Conservancy, and the County Conservation District was a big partner as well. We being actually the Bushkill Stream Conservancy, got several grants to fund the project. And so finally in 2009, the groundbreaking happened, and that was a lot of bulldozers and site work. And, because someone like myself, who's very interested in natural systems and so forth, it was a little bit of a difficult moment to see all of that happening, but I knew, that eventually things would improve. So then 2010, the site was completely built, and folks from the Stream Conservancy and a bunch of students did a lot of plantings in the basin area. But it was basically bare dirt and some weeds. And to see it 10 years later, it's sort of like a forest out there. In fact, I think we might have to cut down some of the trees that are growing on the berm and in the wetland. But it's really taken off. And so one of the nice things about it, in addition to capturing runoff and then having the plants to help improve the water quality, and the sediment can basically settle out of the runoff water, but it's also a nice little habitat there, wetland habitat. And so there were a lot of intentional native plantings put in, shrubs and flowers and so forth. And we've seen quite a bit of wildlife out there, and butterflies and birds and turtles and all sorts of things. So it's really been quite a transformation. And it's really great, I think, for the college to be able to take students there and show them what we mean when we talk about things like green infrastructure. The idea of green infrastructure is basically, it's sort of like biomimicry, using natural systems to accomplish these services that we otherwise have to pay for. And so it's a nice example of that, right, in our backyard, basically. And also, I think the fact that it was such an effective partnership is a really nice story to tell. I think I'm personally really proud of how it turned out. We still go up there with students pretty regularly for different classes in engineering and also in biology. There's a professor who is monitoring different vegetation types and some of the water quality issues and so forth. So it's changed a lot over time, but it's nice to see all that happening.
So then, is there still work to be done, either on this site, future projects that you see, or ways of applying these same sorts of techniques elsewhere in our communities?
Yeah, so lots of parts to that question. Well, at the site in particular, the main issue is, in today's world, globalization and all that, invasive species are a big deal, and that's a problem that doesn't go away ever, I don't think. It has to be managed continually. And we've done a nice job with some species. Multiflora rose basically been eradicated from there, and the purple loosestrife has been something we've kept on top of. But just recently, we've seen a lot of some kind of watercress. I think it's edible. I think somebody could come and make a nice salad out of it, or we could get a moose to come in there and graze it. But it really is taking over the open water area. In the past, we've had a little bit of algae problem as well. So it's just, any of these sites, it's not a situation where you can just build it and walk away. I think people would like to think that if we do things the natural way, then you don't have to do anything with them. But I don't think that's true. But I'm very optimistic about this kind of approach, whether it be in other sites in Easton. It might not necessarily be a wetland because, like I said, you have to have certain hydrologic conditions to do a wetland, but there's lots of potential for example, converting these detention basins, which are just big empty holes in the ground with grass growing in them, into something where we have native plants in there that are functional, provide habitat value, and also do a better job with water quality. So conversion of some existing facilities, you know, a lot of cities on the eastern seaboard, the older cities like Philadelphia, New York, Boston, are using a lot of green infrastructure these days because there's this issue of combined sewer overflows. And, you know, when there's a big rain and all that water enters the sewer system and it overwhelms the treatment plants. And so a lot of it gets just dumped raw into the whatever bay or whatever is there. And so these cities are trying to get a handle on that problem. And what a lot of them are doing are small scale projects distributed throughout the area to try to reduce the amount of water that's getting into the sewer system, rather than, you know, downstream, maybe building a giant reservoir that can hold all that untreated waste and then feeding it back to the wastewater plant. That's super expensive. And doesn't have these other benefits of habitat value, green space in urban areas, all of these things that green infrastructure can do for us.
We mentioned at the beginning that this was in response to some of the flooding that neighborhoods experienced downstream. I don't know if you wanted to talk about any changes you've observed to the flooding risk to those neighborhoods, or if you can speak to the impact it had on that initial problem.
Yeah, so it has been effective. We have data that we've collected during storm events since then. For example, during Hurricane Irene, which was 2011, that showed that the basin, the wetland does fill up with water and then drain out slowly, just as it's designed to do. So it is effective in that way. That's not to say that we don't have to keep an eye on things, because with our changing weather patterns due to climate change, the data shows that we are getting more heavy rainfall in the last couple of decades. We're getting more stream flooding. We're probably going to have more flash flooding. So, you know, we need to stay on top of this just to basically stay even. We have to keep doing more because of how we've shifted the climate in this area. There's lots of potential for these kinds of projects. Funding them is definitely a challenge. They're as opposed to new construction. So if you are a developer and you're proposing some buildings or some kind of commercial development, whatever it is, there's requirements that you have to deal with the stormwater in certain ways, and some of those requirements probably need to be updated. But the point I'm making is that if it's an existing problem that isn't tied to a new development, there really isn't a lot of mechanisms for funding those projects, although some cities are now instituting fees that can help support issues like this existing flooding problem. So a lot of the larger cities, again, are having to fund these stormwater related programs, and the way they often do that is with a user fee. It's usually not a lot of money, but it's spread out a lot around, you know, a lot of people. And I think the idea is that these are non-point source problems, and we all contribute to them in one way or another. We can't just pretend that nature can absorb our impacts indefinitely, certainly up to some level, probably. We keep putting more people on the earth, and we're going to keep having more impact. So we have to be willing to deal with that.
Is there anything else about the Sullivan Park project that I missed that you think is important to highlight?
I think, you know, I think one of the things, I mentioned this before, but partnership projects are challenging because you've got a lot of people with a lot of different ideas potentially about how things should be. But in the end, they're usually the better for it, because you have to think about other people's needs and how to do something that everyone can get on board with. And it would be great if there were more projects like this, where you have the city, you have college, you have non-government advocacy groups, you have county agencies, all working together with a common goal. It's not like this is the only project like this. There are other projects. There's a really a nice Lake Mincy project that's going on farther north in Northampton County, where it's the same kind of thing. It's really been a partnership of a lot of agencies and a local concerned citizens group and so forth. And that's, I think it's a model that I'd love to see more of. The world we live in is complex, and if people don't get involved in the solutions, people just tend to complain and point fingers. And if you're part of the problem and part of the solution, you can take a lot of pride in what you've accomplished.
Thank you for talking about this project with us.